Maybe the most famous castaway case is Jose Salvador Alvarenga. He was documented to have been adrift at sea for 438 days. It's one of the most miraculous stories of survival in history, and it's easy to see why. Beyond just the grueling physical aspects, there's something innately identifiable about the mental struggle of drifting endlessly in the open ocean. As incredible as his story is though, and although it's often cited as the longest time adrift at sea, there is another story from 2 centuries earlier that, if the records are accurate, is the true record for the longest time adrift. This is the horrifying and tragic story of the Tokujo Maru. In the early 1800s, at a time when ocean travel was making the world smaller and more accessible, Japan was a country moving in the opposite direction. Rather than opening itself to the world, it had chosen to turn inward. The period was known as the Edo era, named after the city that served as the seat of power for the shogun, who was a military ruler. Although Japan still had an emperor, he was by this point a symbolic figure, and real authority actually rested with the shogun's military government. It was this government that had concluded that outside influence was dangerous. The memory of European missionaries and traders from the 1500s still lingered. Christianity had spread quickly into certain regions, and with it came loyalties that did not align directly with the shogunate, and from the government's perspective, this was unacceptable. By the 1600s, strict measures were in place, and foreign missionaries were expelled, and most foreign ships were turned away. Japanese citizens were even forbidden from traveling abroad, and those who left were not allowed to return. Only limited exceptions existed. The Dutch were permitted to trade with a tiny artificial island in Nagasaki Harbor under heavy supervision, and some trade continued with China, but beyond that, Japan was closed for all intents and purposes. And so for the average Japanese citizen, Westerners were not a part of daily life at all. They were instead associated with folklore more than personal experience. And this isolation policy influenced everything, including how goods moved within the country. Japan's terrain made long-distance land transport inefficient. Mountain ranges cut across the islands, while rivers, forests, and steep slopes hampered overland travel. Roads existed, of course, but they were not designed for large-scale freight movement like we see today. Political control also played a role, as limiting infrastructure inhibited regional lords' ability to mobilize independently. It was under these conditions that the sea became the backbone of Japan's commerce. Each year, tribute shipments to the shogun came into the city of Edo, which we now know as Tokyo. Rice and other agricultural goods were delivered there as part of a political system that reinforced loyalty and hierarchy. After harvest season, vessels loaded with cargo would move northward along the coast from agricultural centers in the south, while traveling familiar waters and stopping at known ports. And so Japanese ships at the time were built specifically with that corridor in mind and nothing beyond it. But that design decision would sometimes come with tragic consequences. Coastal cargo ships common during the Edo period were known as bezaisens. These ships were large by domestic standards, often around 100 feet or 30 meters long, and capable of carrying substantial quantities of rice, soybeans, and other tribute goods. Despite their size though, they were not engineered for deep ocean travel. Unlike European vessels of the same era, which were built with deep keels and heavy internal framing for long voyages across open water, they were constructed with relatively shallow hulls and minimal structural reinforcement. Their broad, flat-bottom design allowed them to move through coastal waters easily and approach shallow harbors without issue. Their large rudder could even be raised when necessary, making beach landings possible and simplifying the loading and unloading process. And again, for short coastal runs, this made perfect sense. A bezaisen could hug the shoreline, stop frequently, and take advantage of predictable currents and wind patterns. If a storm rolled in, crews even had the option of seeking shelter along the coast. Beyond sight of land, however, those same features became weaknesses. Without a deep keel to stabilize the hull, the ship became more vulnerable to rolling and heavy swells. And while the structural framing was sufficient for regional trade, it was not meant to withstand the prolonged pounding a ship would experience from deep ocean waves. Most importantly though, steering control was critical. These vessels relied heavily on their large rudders to maintain direction. If that rudder failed, meaningful navigation was nearly impossible. The mast system was designed with coastal travel in mind too. It was serviceable in moderate winds, but in violent storms, the tall mast could place enormous strain on the hull. In extreme conditions, it could become a liability rather than an asset, but again, none of this was a flaw in the design. Bezaisens were not poorly built ships, rather they were specialized vessels optimized for a specific environment, and as long as they remained in that environment, they functioned perfectly. In October of 1813, one of these boats, named the Tokujo Maru, left port under the command of Captain Jukichi. The ship had just completed its northbound delivery of tribute goods to Edo and was returning toward Toba, still carrying several hundred bags of soybeans. The voyage to Edo was routine and unremarkable, but to return home, the ship had to pass through Enshu Nada. This was an exposed stretch of deep water, sometimes called the Bay of Bad Water, and it had a reputation for ruthlessly harsh conditions. Mariners knew that this section of coast had little protection when storms formed offshore, so it was a bad place for a boat to encounter one. As you might have guessed, on its way south from Edo, sometime during the fall of 1813, the Tokujo Maru entered the area and was immediately hit by a typhoon. The timing was terrible, but not necessarily unexpected. Japan's waters are no stranger to violent weather. Low-pressure systems regularly sweep through the region, and typhoons are common during late summer and early autumn, which is often right when the tribute ships were heavily loaded after harvest. Conditions started as strong winds, and soon enough, the waves matched that. As the storm progressed, the seas continued to build, and swells rose higher and higher beneath the hull, lifting the ship and dropping it again and again with force. Since bezaisens were not designed for towering waves, the Tokujo Maru rode over them the best it could. At some point though, the large steering rudder was damaged beyond use. With that single loss, the crew's ability to control their heading vanished. Wind then continued to tear at the mast, and without the rudder to stabilize their direction, the vessel began to move unpredictably. The crew knew they had to do something, or else they'd be at severe risk of the ship capsizing. And the mast, which allows a ship to harness wind for propulsion, can become a weakness in violent gusts. Too much strain and the hull can roll beyond recovery, so the decision was made to cut it down. Bringing down a thick wooden mast in heavy seas would not have been simple, but the alternative of the Tokujo Maru flipping on its side was far worse. By removing the mast, they reduced the wind's impact on the vessel and lowered its center of gravity, making it much more stable in the storm conditions the crew was fighting. When the typhoon finally passed, the Tokujo Maru was still afloat against all odds, but it came at a significant cost. The rudder was broken and the ship was without propulsion. Steering control was effectively gone, and the ship could no longer chart a course along the coastline. It couldn't make for the harbor or even maintain a heading against prevailing winds either. It had essentially become a floating object subject to whatever forces took hold of it next as it drifted toward one of the strongest ocean currents in the world. The Kuroshio Current is often called the Black Current because of the deep, dark color of its waters. It runs along Japan before turning east into the open Pacific Ocean, and it's one of the major western boundary currents of the North Pacific, making it part of the vast subtropical network that circulates water across the ocean. And it moves very quickly, at a rate of about 8 feet or 2.4 meters per second in some places, and extends deep below the surface. Once a vessel is caught in it without the ability to steer, there's little that can be done about it, and the crewmen learned this quickly. When the ship found itself in the Kuroshio, the current pulled the Tokujo Maru away from Japan's coast and carried it outward into the Pacific Ocean. And as mentioned, this type of ship was not built for this kind of water or any kind of long distance, but this was the predicament the men found themselves in. Not very many details are available on what would happen over the next handful of months, but in the early days after the storm disabled the ship, the crew likely believed that rescue was possible. After all, they were experienced sailors and they understood coastal shipping routes. They were still within what they understood to be traveled waters, and plenty of other ships would likely be in the area, so they held on to hope that someone might spot them. As for survival, their ordeal was far from dire in these early days. They had food on board, including rice and a plentiful supply of soybeans. The crew could also fish and they collected rainwater to drink, but they still needed to ration what they had available to them. As long as they could maintain that level of discipline, they could survive for some time. The damaged boat moved south and east, carried by the wind and strong current. Repairs were probably attempted at some point, but if this was the case, the storm had damaged the ship so badly that any efforts would have been impossible. Days passed and then weeks followed in these conditions with no sight of any ships. Soon enough, the once familiar coastline disappeared entirely, and only the ocean could be seen in every direction. When the new year came and went without any sign of being saved, something shifted among those on board the ship as hope faded. Now fully adrift in the Kuroshio Current, daily life aboard became repetitive and uncertain. As weeks turned into months, the ship drifted further east into waters that Jukichi and his crew were not familiar with. In fact, no one aboard had ever traveled this far from Japan. They wouldn't have even known where they were, and the psychological strain of the ordeal was a constant presence. Jukichi, as the ship's captain, carried the burden of leadership and needed to project a sense of calm and purpose, even as their food supply dwindled and the men weakened. The steady supply of soybeans kept the men eating, but it didn't constitute a complete diet, and this would soon catch up to those aboard the Tokujo Maru in the form of scurvy. Scurvy develops when the body is deprived of vitamin C for an extended period. Since a serving of soybeans contains only about 6% of the recommended daily intake of vitamin C, the crewmen weren't getting much, and without it, a host of symptoms started to set in. Collagen production slows, reducing the strength of skin, muscles, and bones. Blood vessels weaken and bruising becomes both easy and common. Bleeding can occur beneath the skin and from the gums as the immune system deteriorates. So while the crew did have the benefit of a food supply that staved off hunger, they weren't getting nearly the number and type of nutrients needed to remain healthy throughout the ordeal. As a result of this, in early May of 1814, the first crew member died from the condition and his body was placed in the hold. Then another crew member died, then another. Accounts later differed on how many men had originally been on board, as some sources reported 14 to 17 crewmen, while others claimed as many as 35. Language differences from these accounts and memory likely played a role in this confusion, but in any case, what is clear is that the number of those alive dwindled. Men who had once hauled cargo and managed the sails could now barely stand. Their skin grew pale and blotched with bruises. Energy drained, and irritability and despair likely followed, as scurvy affects the mood as well as the body. Horrifyingly, by late June of that year, only 3 men remained alive, Jukichi and 2 crewmen named Ochikichi and Hanbei, and all 3 were suffering from varying degrees of scurvy. As 1814 became 1815, the 3 men managed to remain alive despite their ever-advancing illness. They were severely weakened and their muscle mass had wasted away to almost nothing. Tasks that required strength were performed slowly, if at all. Even maintaining the vessel at a minimal level would have required effort they barely possessed. All the while, hope continued to wane, but every now and again, the 3 would receive some kind of sign that they should remain cautiously optimistic. On January 26, 1815, Jukichi believed he saw mountains on the horizon, their first sighting of land since the Kuroshio current carried them away from Japan. This would have been a shocking yet welcome sight, but the current carried the ship away from whatever he had glimpsed. Unfortunately, there was so little they could do with the circumstances they were forced to deal with that even Jukichi, who had held morale together for more than a year by then, must have understood the reality of their situation. They were simply at the mercy of forces that none of them could do anything about. With no power of their own to get themselves out of this ordeal, the 3 were quite literally just waiting to die. By late March of 1815, the Tokujo Maru had drifted more than 5,000 miles or 8,000 kilometers and had been at sea for about 484 days. This is when something finally appeared on the horizon that would become their salvation. There were sails somewhere in the distance. On March 24th, the American fur trade vessel, the Forester, saw the ship drifting roughly 300 miles west of Point Conception near present-day Santa Barbara, California. The Forester had wintered along the California coast and was preparing to return north toward Alaskan waters. It was commanded by Captain William J. Piggott and operated under the ownership of famed American entrepreneur John Jacob Astor. Upon sighting the disabled ship, William sent his sailing master, Alexander Adams, to board it. What Alexander encountered when he got there was stark and unsettling, to say the least. He found the 3 crewmen alive aboard the Tokujo Maru, but they were severely weakened and suffering the effects of prolonged malnutrition and scurvy. In the cargo hold as well lay numerous bodies, 14 by Alexander's own account, and the corpses were well preserved in the cool, dry conditions of the interior. Communication with the surviving men would have been difficult, as there was a significant language barrier between them and Alexander, but the 3 survivors were nonetheless transferred to the Forester. After 17 months adrift, their ordeal had finally come to an end. The Forester brought the survivors toward the mainland of Alta California, then part of what was known as New Spain. They likely came ashore near Refugio Ranch along California's central coast, although exact details on this varied by account. When they reached land and the 3 survivors of the Tokujo Maru touched solid ground for the first time in almost a year and a half, they were approached by a group of white horsemen. Jukichi would later say that he believed that he was back in Japan and that the horsemen were Dutch, since the only Westerners he knew of were Dutch traders who were permitted limited access to Japan under its strict isolationist policy. In reality, though, these were actually Spanish colonials who helped Jukichi climb atop a horse for the first time in his life. For the next 10 days, he traveled and remained in Spanish territory, observing clothing styles, architecture, and customs that would have been entirely foreign to him. The experience that apparently left the strongest impression on him was when he witnessed the slaughtering of a cattle for food. In Japan at the time, meat consumption was rare and heavily discouraged by Buddhist beliefs. Seeing livestock raised and killed for food was deeply unsettling to him, but he was still grateful for the opportunity to eat a more nutrient-rich diet to reverse the effects of scurvy and malnutrition that had ravaged his body for months. The survivors of the Tokujo Maru were then nursed back to strength as best as possible. From California, they were transported north to Bodega Bay and then to Sitka, the capital of Russian America, where plans were made to get the men back home. In the summer of 1815, the Forester departed Sitka with the intention of sailing to Japan to drop the survivors off, but navigation through the Kuril Islands proved difficult. The vessel was then forced to turn back, eventually arriving in Petropavlovsk that September. From there, arrangements to return the men to Japan changed. The Forester actually returned to California, and the Japanese crewmen were eventually placed aboard a Russian vessel to continue their westward journey. It was a prolonged affair, and during this extended passage, Hanbei passed away, having finally succumbed to the effects of scurvy. Only Jukichi and Odakichi endured the full return, and by late spring of 1816, they arrived home after roughly 2.5 years at sea. The two men returned to a country that had long since assumed they were dead. After the public learned about the long ordeal they had lived through, Jukichi was granted honors and awarded the surname Ogiri, a distinction that marked him as someone who had endured something extraordinary. Centuries later, he would be formally recognized by Guinness World Records for the longest documented time adrift at sea. This is a record that still stands to this day. He also holds another distinction that is important to American history. Long before Japan officially opened its ports to the west, Jukichi became the first known Japanese citizen to set foot in what is now California. Despite the many recognitions, though, his later life was not one of wealth and notoriety. Accounts suggest he faced financial difficulties and long periods of isolation. He spent much of his new life in Japan trying to establish a memorial for the Tokujo Maru crew members who died during the drift, but sadly, he never succeeded in this effort. Jukichi died in 1853 around the age of 68. If you made it this far, thanks so much for watching. I just want to give a shout out once again to everyone for all of the amazing story suggestions. This is another example of a story recommendation that turned out to be incredible that I might not have heard of otherwise. And then finally, I want to give an even bigger thanks to everyone who supports the channel on YouTube as a member or on Patreon. Thanks again for all of your support, and hopefully I will see you in the next one.